3 hours.
In comparison to your days at CNN and VH1, how does a day of recording at the JBP compare? It's definitely more VH1 than CNN. On VH1, like, I knew when a long day was gonna be a long day. You know when you get there at 10, they're not gonna show up till 12. And you know when it's supposed to end at 5, it's really gonna end at 8. That's once a year.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? This is every Tuesday and Friday. I think sometimes the long day, that last hour, I don't think is always our best hour.
Right.
Like, I feel like if we stopped 30 minutes sooner, the show would actually get better and everybody would be excited to get to the finish line.
He got a blinking thing. What is that?
I don't know.
I figure side effect of medication.
I thought he was back on that shit.
Yeah, this episode of the JBP Rewind might end up being a major turning point for the podcast. Throughout the episode, Mona and Marc spend time reflecting on Joe Budden as a leader, discussing his moods, and even suggesting that he may be pushing the cast a little too hard. What happened in this episode honestly deserves a second look. When you examine this first season of the Rewind, one thing becomes pretty clear. Several cast members haven't exactly been eager to fully open up. First, there was Ice, who appeared on the show and seemed reluctant to discuss the Flip situation, quickly shutting down that conversation. Then you had Marc, who has been operating within this strange gray area where it's hard to tell what's real and what's part of a storyline, almost like professional wrestling. But in this particular episode, things felt a little different. What surprised me was how aware Marc seemed to be of all the narratives surrounding the show, yet he still didn't hesitate when it came to his portrayal of Joe as a boss. One of the biggest moments came when Marc joked that he thought Joe was on that again. Now, obviously it was a joke, but Joe has always seemed especially sensitive to jokes involving drugs. That's been attached to his public image for years. Whether it's the old dusthead comments or other jokes that have followed him throughout his career, it's a topic that tends to stick. So when Marc made that joke, I was honestly surprised he didn't think about how it could be interpreted later. The first time I watched it, I didn't even fully process it. But after revisiting the episode a couple of times, I found myself thinking, wow, Marc really took a big swing there. Another interesting moment came when Marc was comparing different workplaces. He brought up CNN, VH1, and the Joe Budden podcast. At one point, Marc Lamont Hill said the JBP felt more like VH1 than CNN. Then he explained that during his time at VH1, he might have had to work from around 10 in the morning until 8 at night, but those kinds of long days only happened once or twice a year. Meanwhile, according to Marc, those extended recording sessions happened twice a week on the Joe Budden podcast. From that conversation, you could tell he was feeling worn down by the production schedule. It sounded like the workload was starting to catch up with him. Deep down, I imagine part of him is thinking, man, this might be the hardest I've worked, and it's for a platform that doesn't carry the same prestige as CNN or VH1. And that's where it becomes a reflection of Joe Budden as a boss. If I were Joe, I'd probably be wondering whether Marc Lamont Hill would publicly criticize his employer this way if he were still working at CNN or VH1. Would he go on another platform and complain about long production days? Or does he feel comfortable doing it because it's Joe, someone he has a personal relationship with? For a long time, discussions about the podcast have centered around the idea that people working there sometimes get away with things because they know Joe personally. And for a while, many people believed Marc Lamont Hill was too professional to ever lean into that dynamic. But what we're seeing now almost feels like the academic version of it. Marc can critique Joe without necessarily viewing it as criticism. He analyzes, he compares, he uses analogies and breaks things down intellectually. Yet, despite the different presentation, he ultimately landed in a similar place as Rory, Mao, Queen's Flip, Ice, and others before him. The message was essentially the same. Joe's management style can be unorganized. The workflow isn't always ideal. Recording sessions run too long. Patreon episodes sometimes stretch further than they need to. Now, Marc Lamont Hill will receive pushback for those comments because there are plenty of fans who want the podcast to be as long as possible, regardless of whether every minute is top-tier content. And honestly, quality is subjective. There are listeners who spend hours commuting, working, or driving long distances. They're not necessarily looking for the greatest podcast ever made. They're simply looking for something familiar to help them get through the day. There are definitely listeners who demand elite-level podcasting every single episode, but there's also a large portion of the audience that's perfectly happy having Joe Budden and friends playing in the background while they go about their daily routine. Marc Lamont Hill had a lot to say in this episode, but he wasn't the only one. Mona, who co-hosted the episode, expressed many of the same feelings. She talked about being tired, feeling drained, and reaching a point where she was simply ready to be done. And honestly, that's where things get a little complicated. Can Mona really be the spokesperson for that argument? The situation is interesting because she has supporters who get upset whenever people mention her being late, yet here she is discussing how long the podcast recordings are. At the same time, one reason those recording days might run longer than necessary is because Mona has been late on multiple occasions. Not only that, but there have been episodes where she arrived late and then left early. At a certain point, it starts looking a little messy. I can't help but wonder if Joe is sitting there thinking, I've done everything I can to make Mona feel comfortable. I've worked hard to help her transition onto the show, and she still views me like some chaotic undercover boss. It's honestly wild when you think about it. But let me know what you think about the rewind, because things became even more interesting afterward. In the episode that followed, Joe Budden responded directly. He addressed their comments on Patreon, and he also brought it up on the main podcast. He basically made it clear that he couldn't believe they said some of the things they said. And that reaction raises an important question. Will Joe's responding so strongly make people less comfortable being honest on future Rewind episodes? Will cast members start holding back because they know those conversations might create problems later? That's what makes this whole thing fascinating. When you look at the history of shows launched under the Joe Budden Podcast Network, many of them seem to run into issues eventually. Take Podwives, for example. The relationships connected to that show appeared to fall apart, and the show itself hasn't returned in quite some time. What's interesting is that many people described it as one of the network's biggest successes. Personally, I was never a huge fan of Podwives, but plenty of people really enjoyed it. Then there were Ian and Melsa. Nothing disastrous came from that project, but it did reveal differences in how the network approached content and business decisions. At some point, someone behind the scenes showed initiative, and Ian essentially said, "Why don't we turn this into its own show?" I've always felt that Ian and Melsa came from a realization that the behind-the-scenes footage wasn't generating enough interesting conversations on its own. People weren't speaking up, they weren't revealing much. So Ian had to create situations and storylines that would make the behind-the-scenes content more entertaining. Eventually, that evolved into its own spinoff. Now, a lot of the BTS footage is simply cast members hanging out, occasionally revealing something interesting. But I've heard many people say the behind-the-scenes footage is where some of the real tension between cast members becomes visible. Let me know if you agree with that. Alright y'all, that's my take on this situation. I wanted to do a deeper dive into the Rewind episode featuring Mona and Marc because I thought it was genuinely insightful. What made it interesting was watching two of the most prominent personalities on the show navigate a creative project they don't actually control. At the same time, they're operating within a business. The Joe Budden Podcast is a company, it's a brand, it's an organization, but the people around it often don't treat it the same way they treat a major corporation like iHeart, Viacom, or another large media company. Instead, they treat it like they're dealing with a regular guy, and you can hear that reflected in the way they speak. Would they talk about a major executive this way? Would they openly critique leadership in the same manner if they were working for a larger corporation? Maybe, maybe not. But they clearly feel comfortable talking about Joe Budden this way, and I think that's one of the most interesting parts of the entire discussion. I'm not upset about it, I actually find it fascinating. At the same time, it's pretty obvious that some of those comments got under Joe's skin. Alright y'all, let me know your thoughts in the comments.